What is going on, everybody? Good to be back with you again on a Wednesday night live stream. We've now made it to John 19. So thank you once again, everyone that will be tuning in and going along this journey through Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection with us, going through 19. We've already started talking about it a little bit, about Jesus being handed over to Caiaphas, but now he's with Pilate. And Pilate questioning him. And that's basically what we're looking at in this main section, is really Pilate questioning Jesus and the Jews' influence as well. So we'll be starting in verse 1, but you look from the few previous verses, 38 through 40, you see that Pilate finally hands Jesus over to be crucified back in chapter 18 verses 38 through 40. And he finally caves to the Jews. Then they rather have Barabbas than Jesus. So he finally caves to the Jews and gives them what they want. They take Barabbas to be set free, a robber and a murderer, over Jesus to be free, the Son of God who has done no wrong. So that kind of sets it up here for chapter 19. So tonight we'll be in verses 1 through 16 of John 19. So let us start in verse 1. It says, "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, 'Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him.' Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, 'Behold the man.' Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' Pilate said to them, 'You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him.' The Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God.' Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?' Jesus answered, 'You could have no power at all against me, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin.' From then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, 'If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar.' When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, in about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, 'Behold, your king.' But they cried out, 'Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!' Pilate said to them, 'Shall I crucify your king?' The chief priests answered, 'We have no king but Caesar.' Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away." So ladies and gentlemen, that is verses 1 through 16 of John 19. More unfolding leading to Jesus' death on that cross for the sins of the world. That's you and me. But he loves us that much. And we see here he's really going through, if you will, the rigmarole, still dealing with all of these people. First Caiaphas, and now Pilate. Jews, that Jesus was innocent, but he finally caved to the Jews because they wanted him crucified. So really that's the big picture of this section right here. Pilate and Jesus' conversation, the Jews' influence on him, Pilate. So let's look back at verse 1 and see how it all comes about. We see back in verse 1 of John 19, it says, "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him." So there we see it. He relents, or if you will, he gives in to the Jews' desires. What the Jews wanted, he did. They decided to take Barabbas over Jesus. And so Pilate, he scourges Jesus. And really what a scourging was like in that time, it was a punishment for them. You could get up to 40, if you will, scourges, if you will. And it was done with a whip, 3-pronged whip that had like lead in it. And I've heard glass and different things too. And that's what they would use to whip you. And it was up to 40, which would usually be around the point of death. And so that's what they did to Jesus, starting with in verse 1. But it doesn't just end there. Verse 2, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. So if you think a scourging is bad enough, it goes way beyond that. Not only do they scourge him, they make a crown of thorns. It says they twisted it together. And if you read in the other books, they shoved it on his head. They press it down to where it would actually penetrate his head. I actually remember going to a VBS, and there was actually, if you will, a crown of thorns there, and just so we could see what it looked like. And they actually would let us, or they would gently put it on top of our head to see what it felt like. And even that, you could feel it pointing and everything, or poking you. But it was basically made of just, thorns and different things and intertwined, wrapped together, and that's how a crown was made. Yet they shoved it on our Savior's head. They put it on his head and put on him a purple robe. And actually there is a significance in purple. Purple meant royalty. And so we see here that they're making a mockery of Jesus. They're giving him a so-called crown, and they're putting on a purple robe. And you may remember, for us that were here Sunday night going through this Bible study, Pilate was asking if he was the king of the Jews. But Jesus was saying his kingdom is not of this earth, but beyond. And we know that that kingdom is heaven, the kingdom of heaven where he resides. His kingdom up above. But that's what was talked about Sunday night. And so here we still draw the connection here of them mocking him of being a king. We go to verse 3. It says, then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. So still making a mockery. They've scourged him. And as I said, it's a 3-pronged whip with like glass and lead and different things in it. Bad enough, if you get whipped with it, it can rip the skin back and the flesh back and really just tear you up. They do that. They hurt him in that way physically. They shove a crown of thorns on his head. They would go into his head. They put a purple robe on him. And imagine that, getting a robe put on you after you've been whipped. Skin or meat sensitive, what's left of you there, and yet they put a robe on you and then say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And not only that, but they strike him too. They slap him with their hands. So we haven't even got to the crucifixion yet. But we see all these things leading up to it. We always think about Jesus being nailed and dying on the cross. But may we never forget all of the pain and suffering he went through just to get to that point of dying on the cross for you and me. And as I've been saying through this Bible study, he didn't have to take any of that. Unlike the patience, the love, the self-control to just stand there and allow them to do that to him. What would be your first instinct if someone slapped you? You'd want to slap back. It'd be your first instinct to protect yourself. And he could have done that. He could have snapped his fingers and they all been dead because he's God. But he didn't do it. Why? Because he loves you that much. He took it all for you. Died for you. But here we see, as we go into verse 4, they made a mockery in these verses. We see in verse 4 where it comes back to Pilate. So verse 4 says, "Pilate then went out again and said to them, 'Behold, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him.'" So even though Pilate is, if you will, already caved to the Jews, he's still trying to tell them, "I have found no fault in him." There's no need to give him the death penalty. There's no need to do anything to him. He's still trying to remind them, "I find no fault in him." Verse 5, "Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, 'Behold the man.'" Capital M here in my Bible. Not just any man, but the God-man. Jesus himself. So he's letting them see him. reminding them that he hasn't done anything wrong. There's nothing he's done wrong. So he sends them out there so they can see him. And do they have sympathy for him? Do they feel bad? Like, oh, because of us, he got slapped. He got whipped. He got a crown of thorns on his head. Do they feel bad for any of this at all after seeing him there? Verse 6 gives us the answer, and it doesn't look to be that answer. Verse 6, therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that they had no remorse or felt sad for what Jesus had gone through. Imagine if someone went through all that pain and you know you're the one to blame. Wow. But they didn't care. They wanted him dead. And you know, it's still the same today. There's still people that mock Jesus, could care nothing about him. But that's why we're here, ladies and gentlemen, as the representatives of Christ, to share the gospel, shine the light, tell of people what he's done for them, and to shine that light to them of what Jesus did, and that's die for them out of love. But that's their answer. Crucify him. Crucify him. And in that verse it goes on to say, Pilate said to them, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. So we see here Pilate's still wanting to stay out of it to an extent. He's compromised. He's caved to the pressure of the Jews, but he's still trying to stay out of it. As we see, it's a slow fade with him. He gave himself away. He's still trying to urge the Jews. No, he hasn't done nothing wrong. But he caves and allows them to take him and mistreat him and abuse him in this way. And he still wants nothing to do with it. So that's why he's trying to pass it off on them. You go and do it. He's trying to stay out of it. But look what we see in verse 7. And this connects with what we talked about Sunday night. Verse 7. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Now, for those of you who were here Sunday night, you may remember that they asked, or that Pilate asked why they brought Jesus here, or what, and they said, well, if he hadn't done evil, we wouldn't have brought him here. And you may remember how we talked about how the Jews didn't really have an answer of what evil he had done and why they brought him there, because he hadn't done no evil. That's why, but they couldn't tell Pilate, or they didn't tell Pilate one thing that he'd done wrong, but just really that answer of, well, he's here, ain't he? So he must have done evil. But no, they just dragged him there. Well, now they're giving an answer. They're actually giving an answer this time. What is their answer in verse 7? The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. And that was part of their law, blasphemy. And it would be blasphemy if it wasn't true, but guess what? Jesus is the Son of God. So there's no blasphemy there. If I said such a thing or made such a claim or anyone else did, yes, that is blasphemy against God. And if Jesus wasn't God, there would have been blasphemy too. But Jesus wasn't blaspheming. He was simply telling the truth. And if the religious leaders would have remembered or really took account of what they knew and what they studied in the scripture, they would know and still know that a Savior was to come. But they denied Jesus here. They were looking more for a military king. They feel threatened by Jesus and that they would lose their power. Jesus didn't come, if you will, to overthrow the Roman yoke on them. He come to overthrow the bondage of sin. And that's just what Jesus did as we see the story unfolding to get to that point. Verse 8, therefore when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. I suspect so. Now he knows that Jesus is claimed to be God, which they talked about in the last section of John 18. Yeah, he's more afraid, knowing like, ooh, I could be talking to God himself. And he's here in my presence, and what I've allowed to be done to him and the decisions I make. So yeah, he's even more afraid. Verse 9, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So after hearing that, he goes back to Jesus again. And he was asking these things before, and even asking what is truth, which is such a great question in this day and age. And perhaps a better way to say it is, who is truth? Which is Jesus Christ. But now he's hearing that he's claimed to be God, so now he's asking more about it. But Jesus gave him no answer. The self-control, the meekness of Jesus. I was listening to a sermon on AFR on the way here, and they were talking about, or the pastor was talking about meekness, and how Jesus was the meekest man in the world. God himself, meek, which is power under control. Not wimpy, not passive, but power under control. And we see here that Jesus gives no answer. So Pilate speaks up again, verse 10. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" So we see here, perhaps Pilate not being so meek. He's reminding Jesus of what he thinks is so-called power and what he thinks he can do to Jesus. He thinks he can do anything to Jesus because he is Pilate, the one in charge. But not thinking or realizing you're talking to God himself. Oh, you can't just do whatever you want to God. Jesus gave the answer. It's only what is allowed. Verse 11, Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." So even Jesus is saying the only reason right now is because God has given you power. Only if God has granted it to you from above. As we talked about Sunday night, his kingdom not of this world, but rather the kingdom above, heaven. Pilate only can do what God will allow him to do. It was the same with Satan with Job. You may remember that Satan wanted to take Job and tempt him, destroy his life, and God's like, he allowed him to have his way with Job except to take his life. He only allowed Satan so much. And so even it says in Romans 13:1 that the powers that be are from above. Presidents we have today, kings, any governing authority, it's from God. So Pilate only has what power God has given him. Putting things really in perspective, reminding Pilate of who really is in charge. And that end of the verse says, "Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Now it doesn't excuse Pilate. As we see here, Pilate has made the wrong decisions clearly and is fading away, caving into the Jews more and more as we read on. But he's saying the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. And who did Jesus face and talk to before he got to Pilate? Caiaphas. He talked to Caiaphas and the others. They handed him over to Pilate. And Caiaphas had even saying that it was expedient that one would die for all the people. So it started with Caiaphas, the greater sin, saying that Jesus needed to die. But Pilate has done his wrong as well. But we know it's all to happen this way for our good, because he loves us. Judas, as we talked about, he done wrong too. All of these people doing wrong. But God had a plan through it all. And it's a comfort to know, even though I might not always make the right choice or always do right, it's knowing that God can work through my life and everything and still make it for good, as Romans 8:28 says, "For all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." It's a great thing that I don't have, that even if I make a wrong decision, God can still use it and good can come out of it, and he can still use me for his glory and to serve him. We serve a great, great God. So we see here as we go to verse 12 that Pilate's getting the picture even more. I think it started clicking with him in verse 18. But we see here, it's clicking with them a little more, verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. So here again, Pilate's wanting to let him go. He doesn't want to crucify him. He's not wanting to do any of this. But he still caves to the Jews. Now the Jews are referring to Caesar. And that gets Pilate's attention. It says in 13, when he heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat in the place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. So that caught his attention. He wanted to let Jesus go. He didn't want to proceed any further with this. But that statement right there by the Jews, if you will, that's the one that broke the camel's back. That's the one that got Pilate's attention and caused him to choose to hand Jesus over and seal the deal on that. Pilate was more concerned with his power and, if you will, his image in regards to Caesar than making the right decision. He didn't want to be accused of not being Caesar's friend. As I said, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. So rather than make the right decision, he caves in to the Jews to protect his image and his power to be, if you will, Caesar's friend. Everything all good. All the political buddies keeping that in check and on the up and up. He once again, because of the Jews' pressure, he compromises. And we see here that there's no turning back, if you will. It just continues on. The rest of the stories to unfold, leading to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. As I said in 13, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. 14. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold, your king. So he's still trying. As we see in these verses, he's like, behold your king, behold your king. He's trying. But what does it say in verse 15? Do they accept him now? No. It says in 15, but they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So there they go, bringing up Caesar again. Not caring about Jesus, but rather an earthly king, Caesar. Pilate was trying here. He tried, but he finally caved in, and we see that in verse 16. It says here in our last verse, then he delivered him to them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. So we see in 16 that he caved to them. He just delivered them over to him to be crucified. It says in the other Gospels, or it mentions in the other Gospel accounts, that he washed his hands of it to be like, y'all can have them. But he washed his hands to be like, his blood's not on me. And Pilate could have washed his hands all day long. But it doesn't change the fact that he gave Jesus over. An innocent man, someone he believed to be an innocent man, knew was an innocent man, thought to perhaps be God, and we know is God, gave them up over to the Jews because of the pressure. We see the compromise of Pilate here. And so we see this as the story leading to Jesus' death on the cross, but you can also perhaps picture it as for us today as well. Are we going to be a Pilate and compromise our witness for Jesus, or are we going to stand firm? Pilate here didn't want to do it. We read that over and over, but he finally caved to the Jews. What about us as we live the Christian life? Are we going to take a stand for Christ, the one that died on the cross for us? Or are we going to cave like Pilate when we see pressure from, if you will, the Jews, the outsiders, those that don't believe? What is our decision going to be? Well, we have to make that decision every day. From this, may we not be a pilot, but stand firm for the Lord. Because we see through all this, Jesus stood firm for us. He didn't change his mind or be like, no, this hurts too much. This is too much trouble. These people ain't worth it. And we aren't, but he loves us that much. He could have just like, forget this. I'm going back to heaven. I'm done. It ain't worth it. Forget these people. They can go and die and rot in hell. It's okay. It's what they deserve anyway. Jesus could have rightfully done that, but he didn't. He went through all that and so much more, as we'll see going through the book of John, and he done it for you and me. So just like Jesus here was faithful to his Father all the way to the cross, may we be faithful to Jesus as well, just like he was faithful, and not be like a pilot. May we take that with us. And also through this section, as we close now, remember all that Jesus went through for you and for me. And may we share it with this lost and dying world. So thank you everyone for tuning in once again. I hope you got something out of it. I appreciate everyone that's watching. Thank you for being here. Just to mention, as I always do, check us out on our website, faithstreet/Calvary Baptist Church. This will be uploaded on Facebook as we end here. And we also have a YouTube channel by the name of the church, Calvary Baptist Church of Ashland, Mississippi. So feel free to check us out. And thank y'all once again for tuning in for another Facebook live stream. See y'all next time and have a good night.